You're watching Knowledge and Wisdom, where we explore the depths of history, theology, philosophy, archaeology, and beyond. If you're curious to uncover truth and insight across time, this is the place for you. Really excited about this because I have returning guest Dr. Louis Dizon, who's going to be going over his doctoral dissertation. So really excited about this. Louis, how you been? It's been a little
Oh,
while since I've seen you.
yeah. Yeah, it's been a while. Lots of stuff has been happening. So, as you all know, I got my PhD dissertation back in December. People can call me Dr. Dizon now, which is really cool. And the purpose of this particular channel, or this particular show rather, is to go over the thing that I did my dissertation research on, and also. Some of you may also know that did recently get married as well. It was actually just shortly before um, I got my PhD. In fact, my wife Monica is in the other room right now. So she's moved in with me, and it's been a lot of fun living together.
That's awesome. If you want to bring her on.
Yeah, so just a little bit of bonus. You get a cameo appearance by the Mrs. Dizon. Hello.
Hi,
Hello, nice to meet you.
nice to meet you.
This is Monica. Yeah,
All
say
right,
hello to
congrats.
everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Really
Yeah.
excited for you guys.
Yeah, so she's been watching the live streams for the past little while. So
Is that
yeah,
right?
she'll be in the other room doing her own thing, but then she'll also be listening in on
That's
her own
awesome.
device.
That's awesome. That's great. Well, I'm really excited about this. I think you got your presentation there. If you're ready,
Okay, so
good deal.
um, so as I'm doing my presentation, feel free to stop me at any point and ask questions. And maybe if
Sure,
the audience has questions, I can take those as well
sure.
later on. So, the dissertation topic that I did is on the Islamic use of the Bible. Subtitle is Polemics and Usurpation. So, a little bit of background. I got into this topic because I was interested in doing research on the question of what Islamic attitudes towards the Bible were throughout throughout its history. So there's this idea of, did they regard it as corrupted? Did they see it as useful, or did they think that it was still divinely revealed and just happened to be misinterpreted? And over the course of my research, I tended to focus in on a couple of key figures. So there's Ibn Hazm, who in the 11th century was one of the major proponents of the idea that the Bible was corrupted textually. He's not the first one to assert textual corruption, but he's the one who really popularized the concept. There's a couple other figures that I look at. There's a Jewish writer named Shlomo ben Adret, or Solomon ibn Aderet, better known as Rashba, who actually responded to Ibn Hazm's Fissal. And this is one of the few instances that we know of that an adherent of one of the other two Abrahamic religions did something or said something in response to Ibn Hazm. In general, I don't really see, at least in the medieval and early modern periods, any attempts to respond to the Fissal or Ibn Hazm's arguments. So Shlomo is one of the few exceptions to that. And then a third main figure that I look at is a 15th century Quran commentator named Al-Biqai, who wrote a multi-volume commentary series called the Nazm ad-Durar. And he's known for a number of things in his commentary, but the big thing that he's really known for in academia is his extensive use of biblical quotations in his writings. So he would actually quote entire chapters of the Bible in his Quran commentary in order to explain Quranic narratives. And he's mindful of the differences between the two narratives. And he's very, he will highlight some of them. Other times he'll try to like gloss over those differences by hiding them, which is really interesting in and of itself. So here's my abstract on the screen. So the audience, I won't read the whole thing, but the audience can read it for themselves. It'll give them an idea of what I'm trying to accomplish in my dissertation. So it's mainly a comparison of the three authors that I just looked at, with a view to certain texts that they cite in common. So in the Hebrew Bible, for example, the stories of Noah, Joseph, and Joshua all come up in these three authors. And then for Ibn Hazm and Al-Bikai, they both quote large sections of the New Testament Gospels. So I look at certain texts that appear in both and then see their contrasting responses. And some of the stuff that comes up is going to be really interesting to people. So here's the brief table of contents to give you an idea of what the contents of my dissertation are. By the way, after this, I'm going to upload a copy of the PhD dissertation online, and I'll share a link to it. That way, anybody who wants to read it for themselves will have access to it. So I don't believe, unfortunately, a lot of PhD dissertations, they only get read by a very small number of people. They tend to, get locked away in some library somewhere, collecting dust. But, I want this research to be spread far and wide, and I want it to be readily available, especially to people main whose main interest is comparative religions and apologetics. So some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about does have apologetic value for those who are into doing that sort of thing. So let's start with chapter 1. So the first couple of chapters are mainly introductory chapters, laying the groundwork for the rest of what I'm trying to accomplish. So this is called Muslim Exchanges with Judaism and Christianity. So it focuses on Islam's ongoing conversations with the two prior religions. So the important thing to note is that because Islam is the youngest of the three Abrahamic religions, it really can't be understood apart from the other two Abrahamic faiths. It's been in conversation with the two almost from its very inception. And you can see this if you read the Quran itself, because the Quran frequently mentions the Jews and the Christians and references their stories. You can also see this in early Islamic sources, such as the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq, one of the earliest biographies of Muhammad, who in his writings he actually shows that Muhammad had extensive interactions with Jews and Christians. So Jews and Christians show up many times throughout the Sirah. And one of the interesting things that this shows is that Arabia is actually much more connected with the wider world than we initially thought. There are a lot of Jews and Christians already plying their wares in the peninsula, and many of the native Arabs had in fact converted to one or another of these two religions. There were still some pagans, of course, who did not hold to any of the monotheistic faiths, but there was also sprinkled in some Jews and Christians. Now, much of the interactions in this early period can be described as apologetical in nature. So both the Quran and the early Muslim sources are trying to show the continuity of Islam with prior revelations, as well as establishing the prophet of Muhammad so that Jews and Christians may convert to the emerging Muslim movement. And as a result, apologetical interactions have been a major part of the Abrahamic conversation with Jewish and Christian writers, also responding to their Islamic interlocutors. So it's like a three-way shootout between the Abrahamic faiths, with each one trying to prove that their religion is the one that makes the most sense. So this lays the groundwork for the next chapter, which talks about the three main characters that are studied in the dissertation. So you have Ibn Hazm, you have the Jewish rabbi Rashba, and you have al-Bakai. Now, of these three, Ibn Hazm is the one who lived the earliest. Now, he was a polymath. If you look at his bibliography, he wrote on all sorts of things. In fact, apart from the Thistle, he's known for two other important things. One is his poetry. He wrote a discourse on poetry where he shares some of his own poetry, and a lot of it had to do with like romance. I think it's called like The Collar of the Dove or something along those lines. The other thing that he's known for is law. So he was an adherent of the Zahiri madhab. So for those who are not familiar with Islamic law, in Sunni Islam, there are four main madhabs or schools of law. You have the Hanafis, the Shafi'is, the Malikis, and the Hanbalis. Now, there was a fifth school called the Zahiri madhab that no longer exists. And Ibn Hazm was a part of this particular law school. Now, this law school was known for a few main things. One is that they tended to reject like legal reasoning by analogy, or qiyas as it's known to the other law schools, and they also rejected consensus, ijma. So they tended to go strictly with the Quran and the hadiths. And also, the interesting thing about the Zahiris is that they are hyper literalists. Like, they believe that you go with the face value interpretation of a text to interpret it. And this will come out when you see the way Ibn Hazm critiques the Bible. A lot of his critiques are based on a hyper literalist interpretation of the text that goes even more literally than what any reasonable exegete would do when reading the text. Now, in the field of inter-religious dialogue, his main contribution is a book called the Al-Fisl Mil Milal Walahwa wa Nihal. So you can translate that as the separator of religions, heresies, and sects. So it's a multi-volume work that he did on different religious opinions that have existed throughout history, or at least the ones that he knows about. And what he does is he goes through all of them and he points out all of their flaws. So he'll go through Judaism and Christianity. He'll mention like different Islamic sects as well, such as the Shia, and point out their problems. So his goal is to show that out of all the religions in the world, the only one that really makes sense is his own brand of literalist Zahiri Sunni Islam. And one of the interesting things about the Fisl, which is what we'll be calling it in short going forward, is that it is distinguished for having the most comprehensive use of biblical material found in any Muslim writer up to that point. So other Muslims have used the Bible prior to Ibn Hazm, but none of them show as heavy a use of the Bible as Ibn Hazm. And in fact, we won't see such a heavy use of the Bible again until we get to al-Bakai for completely different reasons. And also, Ibn Hazm is the one who really develops a theory of textual corruption. There's a couple of other writers prior to Ibn Hazm who posited textual corruption, such as al-Maqdisi and Abd al-Jabbar, who I'll mention a little bit later. But they don't really go into much detail about what that entails. Ibn Hazm would talk about, for example, how during the Babylonian exile, the Torah was lost. And then when they returned from exile, Ezra would attempt to recreate the Torah. But in doing so, he ends up corrupting the text. So the contemporary Torah is essentially Ezra's creation. So he blames Ezra for the corruption of the Torah. There's a interesting article by a scholar named Martin Whittingham called Ezra as Corrupter of the Torah, where he posits precisely that point. Now, the Thistle became the source of anti biblical arguments that would later be responded to by Rabbi Shlomo ben Adret, who lived in Christian Spain in the 13th century. So Ibn Hazm lived in the Muslim part of Spain, and Rashba lived in the Christian part of Spain. So if you know your medieval Spanish history, there's the Reconquista, where Christians were slowly reconquering lands in Spain that had been taken over by Muslims. So by the 13th century, a good chunk of Spain had already been reclaimed. And now Rashba was a, his main thing was he responded to, because he's a rabbi, he would write responsa or teshuvot in response to Jewish questions. A lot of the teshuvot that he wrote were apologetical in nature, so he would respond to, for example, Christian missionaries who would try to convert Jews. But he also, interestingly, responded to a Jew who had brought up Ibn Hazm's writings. Apparently, the Thistle was still being cited by Muslims a century later, or 2 centuries later, by Muslims in response to Jews, and the Jews wrote to Rashba asking how to rebut them. So if you read the Teshuvah, it focuses on two issues. One is the preservation of the text of the Torah, and second is the apparent moral failings of the biblical patriarchs and prophets. So, in fact, it's very interesting because Rabbinic Judaism at this time has become very averse to attributing sins to biblical characters. It's very similar to what Muslims believe, actually. So Muslims believe in the sinlessness of the prophets. Rabbinic Jews would later on develop something similar to it, but not to the same extent, with the result that whenever a really embarrassing story comes up in the Bible, what they would usually do is they would try to soften the story. They would add details to it in their midrashic literature that would make the character seem less problematic than they appear in the Bible. I should note that this observation does have an apologetic relevance, because the apparent moral failings of biblical characters is one of the arguments that Muslims will sometimes use to argue that the Bible is corrupted. But that argument doesn't really work, because if we know anything about Jewish proclivities, it's that their proclivity is to actually downplay the sinfulness of the prophets, not to make them look more sinful. We also know that whenever they sought to do that, they would do so not by altering the text of the Torah, but by writing other literature, such as the Aggadic Midrash or the Talmud, that would contain some of these alternate interpretations of the biblical characters. In other words, the Jews are not the sort of people who would invent stories to make the prophets look sinful. So that argument by Muslims doesn't really work. Now, the third character of our study, al-Bikai, lived in Syria and Egypt during the 15th century. So now we're moving to the other end of the Mediterranean. So he actually was born and raised in Lebanon, and then he moved to Egypt. This was during the time of the Mamluk Sultanate, and the Mamluks ruled both Egypt and Syria. So he would actually travel between Egypt and Syria throughout his life. And just like Ibn Hazm, al-Bikai was something of a polymath. He wrote on a number of different fields. So, he wrote on law, he wrote on philosophy, but he is best known for his Quranic commentary, the Nazm ad-Durar, which translates to the arrangement of pearls. Going forward, we're going to just call it the Nazm. So this commentary was noteworthy for its extensive use of the Bible. Like, as I mentioned before, sometimes he would actually lift entire chapters out of the Bible, which is actually quite new Most of the time, whenever Muslims cite the Bible, they'll just take like short snippets out of it, not entire chapters. And there are a few reasons why he does this. Um, so Walid Saleh, who was my PhD supervisor and wrote most of the early research on al-Bakai's use of the Bible, posits that al-Bakai became very enamored with the biblical material, almost like saying he fell in love with the material and wanted to show the beauty of it to his co-religionists. That might be possible, but I can think of a few other reasons why al-Bakai might do this sort of thing. One reason would be that in the Mamluk period, there was a strong tendency towards what we would call encyclopedism. So encyclopedism when is the idea that, you know, I mean, it's come from the word encyclopedia. It's like a full compendium of knowledge. So a lot of people wrote compendia of everything that they knew to show that they were well learned in not just one field but several. So al-Bakai actually tries to show his encyclopedic tendencies in his commentary, showing that he can bring a wide variety of fields to bear in his interaction uh, with the Bible and the Quran. Now, this, as it turns out, was controversial in his day. So, one of his opponents, As-Sakhawi, actually accused him of heresy in doing this. And what ended up happening was that they would try to convince the various qadis to side with one or another of them. So they would get like various fatwas, both either for or against each side. And then what al-Bakai did was he actually wrote a separate treatise defending his use of Bible called the Kitab al-Aqwal, where he mentions, among other things, that the Muslims of his day are basically exaggerating the extent of biblical corruption. He also would show that many judges in his period would side with him over against his opponent As-Sakhawi. Now, al-Bakai did end up getting sidelined later on in Muslim history, and his work would never be as prominent as his other contemporaries until recently, but that was for different reasons. So al-Bakai was kind of a combative figure. He got into quite a few controversies during his lifetime, and that ended up alienating a lot of people. Now, chapter 3 is on tahrif, the idea of corruption of the Bible. So in chapter 3, I focus mainly on the early Islamic sources prior to and up to the time of Ibn Hazm. So tahrif basically literally means alteration. So harafa in Arabic means to corrupt or to alter something. So there are basically two ways that you can alter or corrupt something. You can corrupt the meaning of the text, or you can corrupt the actual wording of the text. So we can speak in terms of a distinction between what's called tahrif al-mana, corruption of the meaning, or corruption of interpretation, and then tahrif al-nas, that's corruption of the text. That's nas spelled with a sod, by the way, for those who are wondering about the Arabic spelling. Now, there's a general observation that a lot of scholars have made. Scholars such as Camilla Adang, Sidney Griffith, who else? David Bertina, I think, as well as Hava Lazarus Yaffe. They've all observed that there is a tendency over time to posit less corruption of the meaning and more corruption of the text. So the earliest Islamic authors generally assumed that the biblical text was reliable and has only been subjected to a corruption of meaning. The shift to textual corruption appears to have taken place around the 10th century. So, for example, I mentioned Camilla Adang. She wrote a book called Muslim Writers on Judaism and the Hebrew Bible. And one of the things she points out in a survey of 10 different authors is that the first one that she really notes as asserting any kind of textual alteration is a figure named Al-Makdisi, who lived in the second half of the 10th century. But now, as I mentioned, even though it existed already at this point, it didn't become widespread yet. So that would happen later at the time of Ibn Hazm. So in this chapter, I actually look at 6 different authors. You have Ibn Rabban, who was an historian Christian who converted to Islam. At-Tabari, the famous historian and Quran commentator and jurist, who also occasionally spoke of the Torah. Ibn Qutayba and Al-Bakilani, a Mutazili judge named Abdel Jabbar. Gabriel Stein Reynolds actually writes extensively about this figure. And then Ibn Hazm. Of these 6, only the last 2 assert textual corruption in their writings. So the first 4, between Ibn Rabban and Al-Bakilani, all take it for granted that the text that they're working with is still reliable, that it is from God, and the issue that has only to do with the interpretations placed upon them by the Jews and the Christians. In fact, 2 of these characters in particular, Ibn Rabban and Al-Bakilani, were known for trying to prove the prophethood of Muhammad from proof texts that they would collect from the Bible. So those of you who engage in Muslim apologetics know that Muslims love to try to find prophecies of Muhammad in the Bible. That tendency goes all the way back to the Quran itself, because the Quran says in Surah 7:157 that the Jews and Christians will find the prophet mentioned in their own writings. And Muslims ever since have been trying to find texts that would corroborate this. And some of them have gotten really creative in trying to find such texts. Now, of the 6, Ibn Hazm in particular provides the most detailed and systematic account of textual corruption. And of all the ones I mentioned, he's the one that really provides examples of problems in the Bible that would constitute evidence of corruption. So Abdul Jabbar and Al-Makdisi, they would assert biblical corruption, but they weren't really too concerned about actually trying to prove it by means of direct quotations. In fact, Abdul Jabbar, it's really funny if you read his writings. He'll come up with all sorts of strange stories about the Apostle Paul that have nothing to do with what you actually read in the New Testament. Now, here's some interesting quotes. So I mentioned that a number of scholars have noted that the early Muslims did not consider the Bible to be corrupted. So here are some of those. So David Bertaina, in an article called Early Muslim Attitudes Towards the Bible, writes, prior to the 11th century, most Muslims did not consider the Quran to be accusing Jews and Muslims of corrupting their scriptures. Most believed that the problems originated with copyist errors in translations, neither of which indicate their deliberate falsification. Thomas Mischel, in A Muslim Theologian's Response to Christianity, which is about Ibn Taymiyyah, notes the following. The early Muslim polemicists, such as Ali Tabari, the Zaydi al-Qasim bin Ibrahim, and Al-Hassan ibn Ayyub, applied the concept of tahrif al-mana, that is, corruption of meaning, to the Christian as well as the Jewish scriptures. The later polemicists of the Ash'ari school, such as al-Bakilani, al-Ghazali, and Fakhruddin Arazi, also approached the Bible as basically sound in its text but misinterpreted by Christians and Jews. This observation is confirmed by Camilla Adang in Muslim Writers on Judaism in the Hebrew Bible, and Sidney Griffith in the Bible in Arabic. So I have 4 different scholars of early Islamic history who corroborate my point that the early Muslims, by and large, did not believe in textual corruption. Now, chapter 4 is going after Ibn Hazm up to the period of al-Bikai. So Muslim attitudes at this period have a stronger focus on textual corruption, thanks to Ibn Hazm's influence. But what's interesting is that the level of corruption varies. So some of them would assert it more strongly than others. So there's 4 writers in particular that I examine in this chapter, and what's interesting is all 4 of them have a different opinion on this topic. You have Al-Karafi, you have Ibn Taymiyyah, you have Ibn Khaldun, and you have Al-Bikai. So Al-Karafi, probably the least well-known of the 4, was an Egyptian judge who lived during, I want to say, the Mamluk period. So that's around the 13th century. So he has the most severe view of textual corruption. So his view is roughly the same as Ibn Hazm. The one difference that Al-Karafi has with Ibn Hazm is that Al-Karafi believes that there are genuine prophecies of Muhammad that have survived corruption. So Ibn Hazm doesn't really try to find prophecies of Muhammad in the Bible because he believes that the Bible is too corrupted to find such prophecies, whereas Al-Karafi believed that such prophecies do still in fact exist. They have survived the corruption of the Jews and Christians, and you can find them in the extant texts. So he would try to find some of those proofs. And in doing so, he's mostly copying the proof texts of earlier writers such as At-Tabari, sorry, not At-Tabari, Ibn Rabban and Al-Baqillani. Ibn Taymiyyah is more moderate, which is really interesting. Ibn Taymiyyah is usually not known for moderate opinions, but when it comes to the Jewish and Christian scriptures, he does actually take a moderate view. So he writes that the previous scriptures only suffered minor or moderate alterations, and that uncorrupted copies of them still exist somewhere. He doesn't tell us where these uncorrupted copies may be found, but he posits that it is still possible to find them. So he rejects the idea that the pure, uncorrupted Torah and Gospel no longer exist. Now, Ibn Khaldun is really interesting. In his Muqaddimah, he actually cites stories from the Torah, and he responds to Muslims who will assert that the stories in the Torah are corrupted by saying that the Jews would not do such a thing to their own scriptures. So he rejects it altogether for the Old Testament. With the New Testament, he's a little bit more ambiguous about what he believes. He doesn't outright state that the New Testament is corrupted, but he seems to imply it when he says that it contains true revelations from God. So when he says that it contains true revelations from God, he's kind of saying that not all of it is revelation from God, but some of it is. So Al-Baqai's, and then you have Al-Baqai. So Al-Baqai is actually of the previous 3 most similar to Ibn Taymiyyah. So he believes only minor alterations occurs. So in his book Kitab al-Aqwal, he talks about the fact that there are 4 opinions that exist among the Muslims of his day. There are those who believe that the previous scriptures were completely corrupted and none of the original revelations contain. There are those who believe that most of the scriptures have been corrupted, but a small part of God's revelation still remains. There's those who believe that there are minor alterations or corruptions in the previous scriptures, but most of God's revelation still remains. And then there are those who believe that the previous scriptures are completely uncorrupted and have only been misinterpreted. Al-Baqai states that he is in the 3rd camp, so he believes that the Bible has minor corruptions in it. but is mostly sound. So he will. So his approach to problematic passages in the Bible is really interesting. I'll show you what I mean in the next section. But when it comes to asserting corruption, he only does so in very rare cases. So I can think off the top of my head of like at most two or three places in his entire commentary where he explicitly accuses the text that he cites of containing corruptions. What does he do the rest of the time when there's a detail in the Bible that doesn't quite match up with the Quran? Well, I will actually show that a little bit later in chapter 5. So here are some representative quotes from Ibn Taymiyyah as well as Ibn Khaldun. So, these are quotes that you can show your Muslim friends when talking about the corruption of the Torah or the Gospel. Ibn Taymiyyah says, whoever says that after the Prophet all copies have been corrupted, he has said what is manifestly false. The Quran commands them to judge by what Allah has revealed in the Torah and Injil. Allah informs that in both there is wisdom. There is nothing in the Quran to indicate that they altered all copies. Make note of that. Ibn Taymiyyah rejects the disappearance thesis that the original scriptures are gone. Ibn Khaldun, in his Muqaddimah, says the following. Someone might come out against this tradition, that is to say the traditions found in the Torah, with the argument that it occurs only in the Torah, which, as is well known, was altered by the Jews. The reply to this argument would be that the statement concerning the alteration of the Torah by the Jews is unacceptable to thorough scholars and cannot be understood in its plain meaning, since custom prevents people who have a revealed religion from dealing with the divine scriptures in such a manner. So Ibn Khaldun says the Jews are not the sort of people who would do such a thing to their own book. Now, let's go to chapter 5, Al-Bikai's approach to gospel problems. As I mentioned, Al-Bikai has a very interesting approach to biblical texts that don't line up with the Bible. And this chapter is just looking at his general approach. So I look at two particular passages. So in his commentary on Surah 3, verses 39 to 43, he lifts several chapters out of the Gospel of Luke and a little bit from the other synoptic Gospels concerning the nativity of Jesus. And then he quotes some of the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels in his comments on Surah 5, 109 to 111. So some interesting observations that I've made regarding his approach to gospel problems. So, analysis of his use of the gospel shows that while he regards the biblical materials as useful for explaining the Quran, his acceptance of them is not unconditional. So, even when he doesn't explicitly assert that the Bible has been corrupted, he will nevertheless make subtle edits to the text that he's quoting. So, for example, if there's a text that refers to God as the Father, he would reword that to make it more acceptable. He would actually take out any references to God as Father. He would also take out any references to Jesus as God. Of course, in the Gospels, there's many of them, and he will silently drop out such texts, or he will alter a word here and there to make it seem like it's saying something else. There are also stylistic changes that he makes. So one of them is that he updates geographical references to make them more identifiable to his audience. So, for example, in the Gospel of Luke, it says that after the Virgin Mary conceives, she goes to a town, an unnamed town in Judea where her cousin Elizabeth resides. The Bible doesn't tell us what the name of the town is. Later on, it acquires the name Ain Karam. And interestingly, when Al-Bikai quotes the text, he mentions the name Ain Karam. So it literally says in his text that the Virgin Mary went to Ain Karam to visit Elizabeth, which is, of course, anachronistic because the name Ain Karam did not exist during the first century. That's a later name that was applied to the place. I should note as well, there's a question of to what extent is he um, doing edits himself, and to what extent are these based on the text he's working with. So we know he's relying on Christian and Jewish translations of the Bible. Christian, of course, in the case of the New Testament, both in the case of the Old Testament. Um, the sort of text he's working with appears to be based on the Syriac Peshitta, just because of some of the um, textual variants that exist in them. So it's possible that he's using a Peshitta based translation into Arabic, and then he makes his own edits to that translation. So here's some examples of changes that he makes. Well, let's see. Yeah, okay. So in Luke 1:43, it is said that Elizabeth, when she meets Mary, asks the question, "Why is this granted to me that the mother of my Lord should come to me?" Quoting the ESV. Al-Bikai, interestingly, changes this to, "From where is this to me that the matter of my Lord should come to me?" So there's actually if you read the Arabic text, the text literally says Amr Rabbi. So the word Amr is the word for matter, and then Rabbi is my Lord. So it goes from mother of my Lord to the matter of my Lord, and the difference is actually a single letter. So the word for mother in Arabic would be So if you want to say the mother of my Lord in Arabic, you would say Rabbi. So it's most likely that the Christian Arabic translation that Al-Bikai is working with originally had Rabbi in it. And then what Al-Bikai did is he added an extra letter Ra in it to change the text to Amr Rabbi, matter of my Lord. And it's not hard to see why he would do such a thing. If you refer to Mary as the mother of my Lord, what are you saying? You're saying that Jesus is Lord, and he doesn't want to say that. So he changes it to Amr Rabbi. So, in other words, there's a Christological reason why he would make such a change. So, here's another interesting change. So, in Luke 1:61, it says that when Elizabeth names her son John, those around her object, saying, "None of your relatives is called by this name." In the Nazim Ad-Durar, he changes to, "There is no one in your nation who is called by this name." So Jinsika in the Arabic. So now, why would Al-Bikai make such a change? The answer becomes apparent if you read Surah 19, Ayah 7 in the Quran, because the Quran claims that John, or Yahya, as he's called in the Quran, is the first person in history to have that name. So there was never a Yahya before he was born. And what Al-Bikai has done here is he has changed the wording of the text to reflect that. So there's no one in your nation, i.e. no one among the Israelites who has ever been called John before. I should quickly note that this is easily shown historically to be false. In 1 Chronicles 3:15 and Jeremiah 42:8, you have two other people in the Old Testament whose names in Hebrew are Yochanan, which is the Hebrew form of John or Yahya. So it is in fact not true that John or Yahya is the first to bear that name. But Al-Bikai wants it to be the case, and he changes the wording of the text to reflect that. Now, we get to chapter 6. You have Ibn Rabban, Rashba, and Al-Bikai on the Hebrew Bible. So this chapter examines the attitudes of Ibn Hazm, Rashba, and Al-Bikai on the Hebrew Bible. And I use particularly their comments on the narratives of Noah, Joseph, and Joshua. My choice of these three texts is because they're quoted by all three. Now, in the Fizzle, he goes through each narrative in sequence, picking out details that to him seem absurd. So one example is that he argues that Joseph being Jacob's favorite son makes no sense because, you know, if the point was to favor the youngest son, well, guess what? Benjamin is younger than Joseph. Remember in Genesis, it says Jacob loved Joseph because he was born in his old age. Well, so was Benjamin, but for some reason, Joseph is the favorite. And he also will pick out passages that imply contradiction. So, in the book of Genesis, for example, when the sons are being blessed, it is said that Ephraim would be greater than Manasseh. Yet in the book of Numbers, it says that Manasseh is more numerous than Ephraim. So Ibn Hazm interprets greater to mean more numerically numerous. I should note that the Bible doesn't say that that's what it means, but he thinks that's what it means. So he uses that as an argument against the Bible. He also does a little bit of textual criticism, interestingly. So Ibn Hazm is aware of the differences between what we call the Masoretic text and Septuagint, or as he calls them, the Jewish version and the Christian version of the Torah. And he will name some of those differences. So he focuses in particular on the genealogies of Genesis 5 and Genesis 10. So I don't know how many of you know this, but the ages of the patriarchs in Genesis 5 and 10 actually differ between the Masoretic text and Septuagint. Most of our contemporary translations are based on the Masoretic text, but um, a lot of early Christians, of course, used the Septuagint, so they would have had an alternate reading there. I should note that the Christians of Al Andalus, because they're good Latin Catholics, would have been using the Vulgate, and the Vulgate generally follows the Masoretic text rather than Septuagint here. So I'm not exactly sure how Ibn Hazm got a hold of the Septuagint, or for that matter, why he would call that the Christian version, knowing that the Vulgate used by the Latin Christians of his milieu tend to follow the Hebrew Bible more. Now, Rashba, in his Teshuvah, uses the same narratives that I just mentioned, but for the opposite reason. He wants to show that the Hebrew Bible had been transmitted without corruption. So, a good example of that is his comments on Joshua. So, he points out that in the end of the book of Joshua, it says that Joshua copied the Torah of Moses. And he uses this as evidence for the belief that the Torah was copied in a line of succession from Moses to Joshua, from Joshua to the prophets, and from the prophets to sages. I don't know how many of you guys know this, but in Rabbinic Judaism, they do have a sort of apostolic succession, but the apostolic succession had more to do with teaching rather than any kind of priestly authority. So they believe that the Torah was passed on as well, both the written Torah as well as the oral Torah. Now, Rashba also comments on the section on Noah to show that the Torah could never be abrogated. So Ibn Hazm in his Fissal actually argues that the Torah is abrogated. And Rashba shows that this could not be the case because when Noah received commandments from God, he essentially received the same laws that Moses would later receive at Mount Sinai. He just received them in a less explicit form. Now, part of this relies on oral tradition. So you have the idea of the 7 Noahide laws. The Bible never talks about 7 Noahide laws, but in Rabbinic Judaism, they have a strong concept of that. And what Rashba argues is that the 7 Noahide laws are just an inchoate version of the 613 mitzvot that are later to be revealed in the Torah. Elsewhere, he directly responds to accusations of problematic elements in the stories. So, for example, the number of persons in Genesis 46, there's some math issues going on there. And Rashba responds directly to that. Now, our third figure, Al-Bakai, also mentions these stories. He quotes them in his commentaries on Surah 1146, 1071 to 73, and 12:4 to 101. But he generally does it in a more approving manner than Ibn Hazm. So he's aware of details that contradict the Quran. In fact, in his comments on the story of Joseph, he even names some of them explicitly, but he refrains from using them as evidence of textual alteration. So what he does is he just names what the contradictions between the two texts are, and then he finishes by saying that as for what the truth of the matter is, Allahu alam, God knows. Other times, however, he does subtly edit out contradictory elements by omitting or rewording them. So one of the common ones would be passages that seem to anthropomorphize God. Like a good example of that is Genesis 6:6, where it says that God is grieved to the heart that he made man because he saw the wickedness of man. Of course, from a Muslim perspective, God cannot be grieved in the heart. So they change the wording a little bit there. Now, he also omits passages for more mundane reasons, such as conserving space. So, for example, his version of the Tower of Babel story tends to be condensed. He also supplements the Torah with stories from the Muslim tradition. So, it's one of the more interesting elements that occurs in his recounting the Noah story is that he talks about a giant named Auj bin Uk who survived the flood because he was so tall that the water only went up to his knees. And then apparently he was killed later on after the flood. Elsewhere, he admits that the biblical Quranic stories differ in some key details, but refrains from passing judgment on either version of the story. I just already mentioned this. There is one place, however, where he does explicitly find fault with the Torah. So, if you read the Quran, it mentions in Surah Yusuf that the brothers of Joseph made 3 trips from Canaan to Egypt. In the Bible, there's only 2 trips. So he accuses the Jews of omitting a 3rd journey to Egypt, which the Quran mentions in Surah 12, ayahs 80 to 88. Which it's really interesting because there's all sorts of differences between the biblical and Quranic stories of Joseph, but out of all of them, he chooses this particular story to find fault with the Torah. So, I guess the other ones weren't as big of a deal for him. Now, we go to chapter 7, Ibn Hazm and Al-Bikai on the New Testament. We drop Rashba at this point because Rashba, being a Jew, has nothing to do with the Gospels or the rest of the New Testament. So there are some Gospel passages that are quoted in both the Fisl and the Nazm. 3 in particular I single out. There's the story of Jesus raising Jairus' daughter from the dead, the story of Jesus rebuking the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the Passion narrative. So Ibn Hazm, he follows his usual course of finding absurdities in the narratives. So here is where I make note of Ibn Hazm's hyperliteralism. I mentioned that this detail is important. A lot of Ibn Hazm's critiques of the Bible assume an interpretation of the Bible that is way more literal than any reasonable person would posit when reading the text. So, for example, when Jesus says Jairus' daughter is merely asleep, Ibn Hazm assumes this means Jairus' daughter really is just asleep. There's another one, which I always find really amusing, where Jesus says that John the Baptist came neither eating nor drinking. And then Ibn Hazm will then say, well, this is clearly false because John the Baptist is said to eat locusts and wild honey. So he did eat something, because in his mind, if Jesus says John the Baptist came neither eating or drinking, that must mean he literally ate nothing. He also looks for contradictory details between different Gospels accounts of the same story. So, you know those skeptic websites on the internet where they list like Bible contradictions to try to show that the Bible isn't trustworthy? Well, Ibn Hazm was actually an early proponent of that sort of argument. He would actually list contradictory details between the Gospels. So, how many times did the rooster crow? How many women visited the empty tomb? How many angels were present at the tomb? He would list these contradictions in the Gospels to try to cast doubt on them. So, yeah. Oh, yeah. And here's another fun one. In Matthew 23, verse 9, Jesus says, "Call no man father." So, according to Ibn Hazm, when Jesus says "call no man father," he does literally mean do not call anybody father. So you can't even call your biological father that. So according to Ibn Hazm, the Bible, this contradicts other passages of the Bible where it says so and so is a father of so and so. You know, so those Protestants who tell Catholics that they violate this text whenever they call a priest father. Well, according to Ibn Hazm, why not go farther? You violate this text anytime you call your own biological dad father, or someone's biological father. And then Al-Bikai quotes the same sets of texts again. He does so in his comments on Surah 4, 157 and 158, the famous "they killed him not nor crucified him" passage. Surah 546, a very apologetically important passage because it says that the Quran confirms the previous scriptures. And then Surah 61:6, where Jesus makes a prophecy of a prophet to come after him named Ahmed. So that's the other reason why Muslims are very keen on looking for prophecies of Muhammad in the Bible, because in the Quran, Jesus says, "Another prophet will come after me." So in contrast with Ibn Hazm, he does not accuse the Gospels of unreliability, although he follows his usual course of omitting or editing details that may offend Muslim sensibilities. One interesting one is when he recounts the story of the Good Samaritan. If you read the story, it's in Luke chapter 10. It says that when the Samaritan finds the half-dead traveler, he bandages his wounds with wine and oil. When Al-Bikai quotes the same story, he only mentions that the Samaritan bandaged his wounds with oil. Why does he omit the wine? Because wine is haram. And of course, anytime the word father comes up in reference to God, he changes it to Lord. So, imagine a gospel text where every reference to God as Father changes to Lord. So he does that a lot. Now, the one place where he comes closest to making an accusation is with reference to Jesus' crucifixion. So when the topic comes up, he makes an oblique reference to Surah 4, 157, which mentions they killed him not and crucified him. And then he promptly shifts to discussing a different story. Now, when Al-Bikai quotes the Gospels, he frequently notes differences between the three synoptic, all four Gospels, but mostly the three synoptic Gospels. Like he'll actually point out small differences in wording between them to a very great degree of detail, way greater than Ibn Hazm, actually. I will say, between the two of them, Al-Bikai is much better than Ibn Hazm in paying attention to detail. Now, the difference between the two is that Al-Bikai does not use these differences to accuse the Gospels of contradiction. So why does he cite them? Well, he just wants to show off. He wants to show that he knows the text and can show you even the minor details of them. The most obvious apologetic point that he raises is mentioning the Paraclete passage as an example of a prophecy of Muhammad near the end of his comments on Surah 61:6. Interestingly, at this point, he doesn't even cite the Paraclete passage directly. He cites Ibn Ishaq citing the Paraclete passage. So there's a section in Ibn Ishaq's Sirah which quotes the Paraclete passage in John 14 to 16, which is the earliest known reference that we have of any Muslim uh, quoting that text as a prophecy of Muhammad. And al-Bikai just takes Ibn Ishaq's quotation and then copies it word for word. So at this point, I want to share some sample quotes. So some of these are just to highlight the things that I already mentioned. So here is an excerpt from Ibn Hazm's Fisl. So this is from volume 1, page 148. Ibn Hazm says, and their Torah states that when Noah was 500 years old, he fathered Japheth, Shem, and Ham. Then it mentions that Noah had reached 600 years of age when the flood came, and that Shem at the time was 100 years old. And then it states that Shem, the son of Noah, bore Arphaxad when he was 100 years old. However, this is an atrocious lie, an abominable misrepresentation, and a senseless folly. This is because Noah was 500 years old upon begetting Shem, and if the flood occurred 100 years later, it is clear that Shem would have been 100 years old. And if he begat Arphaxad 2 years after the flood, then Shem would have been 102 years old upon begetting Arphaxad. Whereas, according to the text cited from the Torah, he was only 100 years old. This is evidently a lie that could in no wise be attributed to God. So catch what Ibn Hazm is doing here. He's saying that, he's doing some math here. He says Noah was 500 years old when Shem was born. He was 600 years old when the flood came. And then Shem had a son 2 years after the flood. So if you do the math, Shem would have been 100 years old at the time of the flood. And if he had a son 2 years later, he would have been 102 years old. But then the Torah says he had a son at the age of 100. So isn't this a problem? Well, only if you're a hyperliteralist, because round numbers are a thing. People do this all the time. They will say about 100, or they'll say just 100, when what they really mean is a number closely approximating 100. So it's quite conceivable that the Torah is using the word 100 as a round number rather than a literal figure, but because Ibn Hazm is a hyperliteralist, he does not allow such an interpretation. So if Shem is said to be 100 years old, he can't be 101 or 102. He must be exactly 100. Now, here's another passage from the Fisl. He says, and this is in reference to the Jairus story. In this story, there's a whole pile of calamities of which just one would suffice for us to infer that the gospel is a lie and supposition. To attribute to the Messiah a clear lie when he said that the girl did not die but was alive and merely sleeping but not dead. If it was true, as he said, she was not dead, it means that there was no need for a wonder nor miracle. May God free us from supposing that a prophet would lie, and much less one who is said to be God. Nor can one say that the miracle consists in bringing the girl out of unconsciousness, since in the text of the gospel we see that he said to her, "Believe and your daughter will live." It follows then that he lied in one of his statements. Now, if you look at commentaries on the Jairus story, pretty much everyone agrees that the girl really is dead. And the reason Jesus said that she is merely asleep is to show his certainty in reviving the girl. But not so Ibn Hazm, because you have to interpret the text literally. So when Jesus says the girl is merely sleeping, he must literally mean the girl is merely sleeping. And then he tries to fabricate a problem out of this. Now, let's go to al-Bikai. In his recounting of the story of Luke, in the birth of John the Baptist in the Gospel of Luke, rather, he quotes the following: "And it was the 8th day they came to circumcise the boy, and they called him in the name of his father Zechariah. But his mother answered, saying, 'No, but call him John.' And they said to him, 'There is no one in your nation who is called by this name.' And they pointed to his father, 'What do you want to name him?' And he asked for a tablet, and he wrote, saying, John." So, as I mentioned, there's a one-word difference between the original gospel text and al-Bikai's text, and that is the word nation here. In the Gospel of Luke, it says There's no one in your family who is called by this name. So Al-Bikai makes this change in order to bring the text in line with the Quran. Here's an interesting one. So I mentioned that some texts are less theological, more stylistic. Well, here's one that has a couple of things going on in it. So Pharaoh called Joseph's name explainer of the hidden, and his wife was Basna, and another manuscript Basnat bin Kutifira. So that's how they would render Potiphera. The Imam of Alexandria, and in a manuscript Habar 1. Then Joseph, peace be upon him, went out as the governor over all the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood in front of Pharaoh, and he went in a circuit around all the land of Egypt. So, first of all, explainer of the hidden is actually the interpretation that's given to a phrase that's used in the text of Genesis that commentators are actually not entirely sure what it means, but apparently at this point it was interpreted to mean explainer of the hidden. But notice that Potiphera is called the Imam of Alexandria. If you read the text in Genesis, it says he's the priest of On. So On, is, for those who are unfamiliar with Egyptian geography, is the city that later would be named Heliopolis. So it's a completely different city than Alexandria. So not only is Al-Bikai trying to update the name of the city, he doesn't even get the geography right. Alexandria is several hundred miles north of Heliopolis. And of course, you'll notice that instead of priest, he's called an imam. So has anyone seen any imams in their book of Genesis lately? Apparently, Al-Bikai's version has one. So, conclusions. This study shows how closely intertwined the history of Islam is with that of its Abrahamic predecessors, and how much of the Quran and subsequent Islamic thought would be incomprehensible apart from their interactions. Ibn Hazm and Al-Bikai represent two different ways that Islamic thinkers have tried to navigate that complex relationship, one through the vehicle of polemics and the other through appropriation or usurpation of the text. The inclusion of Rashba in the study also shows how Jews have responded to the challenge raised by Ibn Hazm in his Fisl, and demonstrates that the force of Ibn Hazm's polemics were felt even outside of the Muslim world. And then at the end, I talk about potential vistas for new research. So one such potential vista would be a comprehensive list of biblical citations that appear in the Nazm ad-Durar, because no such comprehensive list exists to date. Even my dissertation only contains a partial listing of such passages. Because we don't really know as of yet the full extent of his use of the Bible. Someone needs to go and read all the multiple volumes that make up the Nazm ad-Durar and catalog where he cites the Bible and which passages. And another potential vista that could be researched would be Christian and Jewish responses to Ibn Hazm's Fisl, because to date I'm only aware of the one that Rashba had written. So it seems like Jews and Christians, for the most part, were either unaware of Ibn Hazm's Fisl or did not have direct access to the text, so they couldn't really respond to it. So it'd be good to see if other Christian or Jewish writers did something similar to Rashba. So that is the conclusion of my presentation on my dissertation. So I'm open to any questions if you or anyone else has. I think you're muted.
Yeah, anybody who has questions, feel free to ask there. I had a couple. I think you mentioned a Jewish man at the beginning, Shlomo.
Yeah, Shlomo ben Adret, or Rashba as he's better known.
Did you say that he was trying to argue that the Torah has been preserved?
Yes, that was his argument. So he's arguing against Ibn Hazm's accusations of textual corruption and he does so by appealing to the chain of custody, as it were, of the Torah, how each subsequent Jewish generation uh, copied the text.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually something that I've been looking a little bit into. So I think one of the difficulties with that, as you know from the Tanakh, is that the Old Testament itself indicates that the Torah seems to have been lost and then rediscovered in the temple.
Right.
It seems that there was this period where they didn't have it. Wouldn't
Mhm.
that create a rupture in that chain of transmission?
Well, I don't recall that any of the Jewish writers, including Rashba, ever explicitly talk about that particular story. If I were to hazard a guess, I guess they would say that, well, yeah, the Torah was, the Torah had been lost for a while and it lay there in the temple. But you could argue that, well, because the Torah was laying there undisturbed, no one would have touched it, and therefore no one would have edited it in the time that it was there. That's
Uh-huh.
just my hunch.
Yeah, yeah. So another question that I had was, I think you mentioned it was the 10th century where we start to see that there was the claim of a corruption in text rather than just in interpretation and meaning. Did I hear that right?
Yes. So it's a little tricky to do a precise chronology of the development of that thought. But if we can speak roughly, it seems like around 10th century, that accusation starts to really appear in Islamic literature.
So, I mean, there's various hadith of the Sahaba indicating that the Torah was, or just the scriptures in general, were corrupted as far as the text itself, not just meaning. How do those hadith factor into these
Yeah.
conversations? You would think that they would factor in to these earlier conversations prior to the 10th
Mhm.
century.
Yeah. Funny thing about the Hadith literature, because it's so massive, just because a narration exists somewhere doesn't mean it was necessarily taken into account
Yeah,
in conversations. So there may have been like one or two stray hadiths in Bukhari that to that effect, but it doesn't follow that Muslims were like using that as an argument.
yeah.
So yeah, so maybe there were like one or two hadith transmitters in the ninth century, which was when Bukhari was compiled, that thought this, but they don't seem to have made much of a splash.
Yeah, you would think that that would factor into these conversations more.
Mhm.
Okay. So when you spoke of tahrif and corruption, what did they indicate was corrupted specifically? The Torah, the Gospels, the Psalms? Like which books particularly were they making this
Um,
accusation against?
so So most of the writings on this appear to be focused on the Torah more specifically. So Camilla Adang, she focused entirely on the Hebrew Bible. She doesn't talk about the New Testament at all. Um, so I would say while it is technically both the Old and New Testaments, majority of the discussion seems to focus on the Old Testament. Um, if that helps.
Yeah. And what are some other examples that they pointed to? Like, was there a really
Yeah.
common example that they said was an example of corruption, either in the
Uh,
or the Gospels or?
Yeah, when the accusation of corruption does begin to appear, a lot of times it has something to do with prophecies of Muhammad.
Okay.
So actually, I believe Gordon Nickel in his book A General Answer has a whole chapter detailing this. That some of the earliest accusations of textual corruption in the Bible have to do with the Jews trying to obscure Muhammad from it.
I
And they
see.
have these really funny stories there about how the original Torah had a physical description of what Muhammad looked like. That he was, of a certain stature. He had a certain hair color, and then the Jews would be like, "We'll change the detail to like a different hair color or something like that." Which is odd because the supposed altered version of the text doesn't appear in the Torah either. So these stories are being created without any actual reference to what the Torah says.
I'm, I'm thinking there the seal of the prophet. Do
Right.
they say that that was one of those things that was corrupted or obscured?
Yes. So some of the early accusations of sexual corruption focus on that, among other things. Like
Mhm.
a lot of the early Muslims really did believe that the Torah contained a physical description of Muhammad, like what he looked like, you
Okay.
know, like his complexion, his height, etc. Um, so it's very different from what we have later, which is like, oh, he's the prophet in Deuteronomy 18, or he's the paraclete in John 14, or he's the beloved one in Song of Solomon 5:16. That does eventually develop as well. But a lot of the early literature focused on like trying to manufacture a story about a supposed physical description of Muhammad that is now gone.
And here's a good question: are you going to be publishing the dissertation?
Yeah, so right now what I'm doing is, the PDF I'm gonna upload online and everyone can have a copy of that. I've also submitted a digital copy to ProQuest, which is where the University of Toronto publishes digital dissertations. At some point, I might also turn it into a book. Let's see if Routledge or Brill or one of those other publishing companies will take it. But for now, that it's just going to be online via ProQuest.
ProQuest. Okay, good. Yeah. Awesome. This was really good, very helpful. Really excited that you were able to come on and do this for us, and really happy for you and your new wife and all the good stuff coming along in your life right now. So really excited for you, and love to have you back on.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe. And for a deeper dive, check out my courses at rtcourses.com and my Patreon channel at patreon.com/reason and theology.